my kids will say I don't need a microphone. I say, you know, I should get a microphone. Mom, you don't need one, trust me. So I'm glad you can hear me. So it has been said that there is no such thing as being non-political. No such thing as being non-political. Rather, if I make the decision to stay out of politics, to not vote, to not be interested, to not engage, then I have also made the decision to allow others to go into politics and to shape politics and to have power over me. By staying out of our current political system, I'm not being neutral. I'm rather working to entrench the status quo. And why am I talking about this? Because this is very similar to the whole conundrum around women and leadership. We know the numbers. Women are either being passed over for leadership roles or they are opting out of leadership opportunity in droves. In droves. No, I'll take a pass, not for me, or they're never being given the opportunity. And by choosing that, or by allowing that to happen, we each become part of the many problems in this world that are at their core problems of an absence of good leadership. So I don't know about you, but I'd rather be part of the solution. And that is exactly where Brescia has placed itself. So Brescia University College sits at the intersection of girls and women and leadership. We are part of the solution, and we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight. So first, before we go there, I want to thank you for joining us. As you've heard, my name's Colleen Hanycz, and I've been the principal of Brescia for 6.5 years. I was saying to Scott in the back that some days it feels like 18 minutes, and some days it feels like 45 years. So depends on how the day is going, but it is a true privilege. I'm passionate about many things, but there is nothing that I'm more passionate about than leadership, and in particular, leadership as it applies to girls and young women, and how we form girls and young women for leadership roles. So I'd like to thank Western's Classes Without Quizzes. It is a delight, of course, Nicole and Kristen, to be here and to share this with you. And you know, I think it's a wonderful model. I'm just going to take a second to put a plug in for that. These are publicly funded universities. And for a university to feel committed to take some of that knowledge that is generated and share that out with the community is really a wonderful activity and something that I'm glad all of you see value in. I certainly do and appreciate tonight's invitation. So tonight I want to accomplish a few things, one of which is to run the slideshow at the same time as I'm speaking, and that is probably going to be the most challenging. We're going to move in a little bit of a circle. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Brescia, for those of you who may not know anything about what's going on top of the hill. And then I'm going to start a discussion about leadership. And I'm going to share with you some rather alarming research that is emerging from all the disciplines, from fields as diverse as neuroscience and sociology and psychology, about some of the barriers to leadership being faced by girls and young women. Then I would like to share with you some other research that quite firmly establishes the need for more girls and women to embrace leadership, not only right here in our community, but across the developed and the developing world. Quite simply, the world needs more girls, more women, to embrace leadership. Despite whatever internal and external barriers they face, and there are many, the world needs more of that. And finally, at the end, we're going to circle back to Brescia with a discussion about how we are approaching this issue by educating girls and young women in this direction. There'll be some time for questions at the end, and so our discussion can continue then. So if there are any questions as we go or any burning issue, be sure to interrupt me. I don't mind that at all, but otherwise hang on to it and we'll talk more about it at the end. So let's begin. I suspect we may have some Brescia alumni or faculty, staff, students, or general fans in tonight's audience, but I also suspect that there is a portion of you who really don't know much about Brescia. So I'm not here to give you the Brescia lecture talking about 100 years of history and community activism. That would be a different speaker on a different night. But I will tell you that Brescia has been absolutely passionate about forming leaders from young women for almost 100 years. In 1919, Brescia College was founded by the Ursuline Sisters of the Chatham Union, and I also suspect that some of you here may have Ursuline ties. Since shortly after they arrived in Chatham, the Ursuline Sisters became deeply involved in educating young people, not only in Chatham at the Pines, but at many other schools in southwestern Ontario, and I think that culminated when they founded Brescia in 1919. So I have spent a fair amount of time immersed in the most impeccable archives that would make a librarian weep that the Ursulines maintain in their mother house, Villa Angela in Chatham. I can confirm that nowhere do you see the word leadership. They don't talk about building leaders, forming leadership. Nowhere do you see that. We see lots of reference to building community, to engaging, to achieving social justice, but nobody's talking about leadership for 100 years. And then when you meet the Ursulines, and you listen to what comes from their lips and what they have accomplished, and especially what they've accomplished at Brescia, again, nobody's talking about leadership. So does that mean, as has been posed to me, that really this is a new twist for Brescia and that the Ursulines were never interested in leadership? No, not at all. I don't think it does. I think it was just a different language. I think the Ursulines through Brescia formed leaders for over 80 years before they decided they could no longer continue in that work, and they handed Brescia over to a lay model, a lay governance model, which is where we are today. So part of what I want to talk about tonight is how we define leadership, because I think that's problematic because it's very hard to find common ground. So when we use the word leadership, what do we mean? I think leadership has become almost meaningless because it is, through the general discourse, it's a label that is slapped on so many things and referred to in so many different ways to have so many different meanings that people are almost backing away from that word because it is just so overused. You see new books on leadership every week. If you go on to Amazon or Chapters, How to Be a Power Leader in 10 Easy Steps. Do you have the traits of good leadership? I mean, there are just countless books out there. But there is this lack of an appreciation of a common understanding. So when you think of the range of definitions of leadership, at one end of the scale, you see leadership defined as a position, as a status, as a symbol. So it is almost, on that end of the scale, it is almost exclusively a title that goes with being the head of whatever it is that you're the head of. Leadership goes with that position. Similarly, there are other groups of definition focus that think about leadership more actively as a series of actions where you're directing the work, the behavior, the will of others. Non-leaders. You're directing the work and the behavior and the will of non-leaders, followers. There's that view of leadership. But similarly, it's that idea of power, having power over others, that you see in that definition. So, for me, anyway, and I think it's fair to say in the work that we do at Brescia, I prefer a conception of leadership that is about as far away from that as you could get. What we are doing at Brescia is based on a very simple definition of leadership as the capacity to shape a vision. So it is the capacity to shape a vision of what might be achieved in the world, and somehow to share that vision with others so that it becomes their own. That doesn't necessarily mean that you are in that leadership position. That doesn't necessarily mean that you are at the front of the pack. In fact, the best leaders often lead from the middle or from the back. Those are the best leaders that I've encountered in my life. But it is an idea that you can somehow have this vision for change. And it goes along with this, the notion, therefore, that anyone can be a leader. And I'm not saying that in a, everybody gets a trophy for coming out kind of way. I don't mean that. But I don't see leadership as a set of traits, something you're born with. Oh, we knew she was going to be a leader. You should have seen her when she was 5. No, it is a choice. It is looking around and seeing something that needs fixing and being part of that change. So at Brescia, we are 5 years now into a branding campaign, and usually universities don't talk about branding. It's sort of a corporate word, but it is what it is. And it's a branding campaign. We call that Brescia Bold, with the tagline, Choose to Lead. We've spent a great deal of time trying to boil down the essence of that choice of leadership. So what is it? Well, it requires courage, requires vision. Most of all, it requires you to decide to commit to fixing something, anything that you think is broken. It can be as simple as a kid with a lemonade stand to raise money for the Humane Society's kitten project. It can be whatever it is that raises in you a passion for change and being part of that. And when you answer that passion and decide to get involved instead of sitting back saying, oh, it's too bad about those kittens, but you actually get involved, something has clicked. You've made a choice and you've chosen leadership. So this, at least for me, is a much more compelling definition of leadership. This is a definition of leadership that characterizes not only the most recent 6.5 years of Brescia's history that I can speak to, but in fact almost 100 years. Because this is what the Ursulines were doing up on the hill for 80 some years before they asked for help from the outside world. And this is what has been their enduring legacy. Brescia has always been about choosing leadership. They just simply use different language. So before I talk about barriers that girls and women face in leadership, I guess the first question is, well, why does it even matter? Why does it matter if girls or women access leadership? Why is that important? So there's a few different ways to look at this, and I'm just going to share with you a little bit of the literature in this area and some activities that have gone on. Has anybody heard of Plan Canada? Have you heard of? Yeah, some of you know of Plan Canada. Amazing organization focused on human rights advocacy. Plan Canada has gathered some very significant literature around solutions to issues in the developing world. So that is their focus. Of particular note is their very well-supported claim, and I'm not going to go through all of the details of this claim, but I assure you the literature and the research has been extensive, demonstrating that when a girl in the developing world has enough to eat, is safe, has access to education, those are the three magic pieces, food, security, education, she automatically becomes a leadership catalyst in her community. She raises the standard of living for herself, for her immediate family, and for rippling out into her community. You'll see Plan Canada very, very focused on giving young women sort of micro business opportunities, microeconomic opportunities. So it might be something like a sheep or 2 sheep or a cow. And you know, you circle back in 8 months and they didn't eat the cow. They used the cow to create a micro industry of milk. Or they bred the cow and now they're selling a calf every year, or whatever it is. But the research is quite astounding at the difference that makes in a community. The same research does not exist for boys. They just aren't finding that same ability to lead change. So similarly, in 2011, the World Bank published an excellent policy piece that attempted to put a global price tag on the impact of excluding girls in the developing world from accessing education and therefore leadership at the same rates as boys. What they found among all of the nations they studied is that investing in girls enough so that they could complete the next level of education, whatever that might be, would result in lifetime earnings for those girls that would be equivalent to 68% of annual gross domestic product. So for those of you who might be interested in business and economics, that is significant in parts of the world that are struggling to sustain. On a very different plane, there have been key studies recently completed by a number of think tanks like McKinsey and Catalyst here in Canada and the US, showing that companies that have more women on their boards or on their executive team have way better results. Not better relational results, but better business results, more profitability, better shareholder returns. In fact, in the US, a study was recently completed using just Fortune 500 companies, and a straight line was drawn between those companies that had more women in leadership and a public perception of the companies as being more valuable and having more ethical behavior. Whether that's true or not isn't the issue. There is a public perception of that, and if you're running a public company and looking for shareholders and confidence in your stock, then that is something that actually hits the bottom line pretty quickly. So there is certainly a growing recognition in the literature that a female voice, whether on the board, in the C-suite, wherever it is a different voice. And that including that voice and that perspective enhances the collective value and the collective intelligence of the organization. This is a small sampling of some recent work. There is a growing body of literature, a growing interest in this. It is not more women just for equality's sake. It is more women because of the demonstrated value that that can bring. And so yet, despite this, we consistently see a failure to give girls and women the tools and opportunities to elevate themselves and those around them. So we're going to talk a little bit about barriers. Yeah. So what are the factors that are preventing leadership from happening? And I find it easiest to divide this discussion into barriers that are internal to the girl or the woman, those that are external, and those that are, typically environmental. So it's a bit of a nature versus nurture debate, but at the end of the day, none of these things is favoring leadership. Not nature, so not your own genetic, biological predispositions, not nurture, the way that we raise girls in our society and elsewhere, and certainly not some of the other environmental characteristics. It's a bit of a perfect storm, really. And none of it favors girls and women accessing leadership. So we'll start with nature. There is a growing body of literature stemming largely from neurobiology, which is quite interesting. The neurobiologists are catching up to what the sociologists have been telling us for decades. And they're indicating, or they've been able to show indications through largely MRI research, so looking at brain activity, what happens to the brain with certain stimuli. Does it light up? Does it not light up? Where does it light up? They've been able to identify that girls and women are simply not wired for leadership. We are not predisposed genetically to embrace leadership opportunities. Not all girls, not all women. As you heard, I taught in a law school and I was a securities litigator for a long time. So I like to think that I was wired for this. I don't know if I was or if I learned it or what, but the research is pretty compelling. Anywhere, margins of error, it looks at about 80% of girls and women that are simply not disposed genetically to leadership. So I guess as the argument goes, essentially, the female version of the species, that would be some of us, we prefer situations that we deem as more safe and more comfortable, less risky, wrapped in familiarity. That is a preference. We prefer to be in familiar, more comfortable situations. The stress centers of our brains become highly agitated or more agitated when a girl or a woman is faced with what she would deem to be a stressful, unfamiliar situation outside of her comfort zone. MRI research goes on to establish that by contrast, the male of our species is quite stimulated by situations where he is outside of his regular comfort zone and trying new things, experiencing the unknown. The brain lights up positively when a boy is faced with the unknown. The thing is, choosing leadership, setting yourself on a course to make a change and to try something different and to try to shift the world around you is at its essence a risky activity. It's stepping out of your comfort zone. And it's encouraging others to embrace this idea, this passion for change that you have. There's always a chance that no one will follow you or that it won't work or that it'll be uncomfortable or people make fun of you and you think of little kids doing something that is very unfamiliar to them, or that people just simply won't agree with you. So for women, choosing leadership becomes a risky activity. And again, my caveat, not every woman. Some of you are sitting there saying, that is not me. And that I get that. I'm pretty sure it's not me. But 80% is what the numbers seem to predict. So where does nurture fit into this? I'd like to say that research coming from the social sciences tells us that there is much less difference now than, say, 50 years ago in how we raise our sons and our daughters. That our girls are raised to embrace adventure in the same way that our sons are raised. However, the converse is closer to the truth. Girls continue to be raised, even in the Western world, in family units that are much less likely to encourage activities that could be described as risky, adventurous, bold, or unfamiliar. I came across a study completed in 2010 that took a very simple activity, that of backpacking around Europe after completing an undergraduate degree. It's amazing what some people focus their research on, but anyway, that was the activity. They compared that activity between young men and young women. There was an amazing difference. In fact, there was a 35% difference in the rate of young men recently who engaged in that kind of post-graduation activity and the rate of their female peers. The authors took great care to control other variables, such as the socioeconomic status, so that it wasn't just wealthy boys, poorer girls, and therefore you were blaming something on gender when in fact it had nothing to do with gender. It was about, ability to head off and traipse around Europe after your degree. So they controlled those variables. They looked at family commitments. They looked at ensuring that the group of research subjects was otherwise very similar. Why this caught my eye, of all the research that I look at, is I thought of my own upbringing. So I'm 48, to give you an idea of when I grew up. I grew up in what I think of as a very enlightened home. And I recall my younger brother heading off when he completed university to spend 6 weeks traveling, with my parents' very enthusiastic support, financial and otherwise. I was 2 years older than him. Well, in fact, I still am 2 years older than him. And yet, when I had graduated 2 years earlier, it had never occurred to me to sort of ask to do that. There was a part of me that sounded very exciting and very exotic, but I wasn't particularly pressing to do that. And had I am quite sure that my parents would not have supported the idea of me living abroad in hostels around Europe out of a backpack for a summer. Now maybe they would have surprised me, but I think my parents would have been concerned about some of the inherent risks in that activity. They would have seen that as riskier for me than they might have for my younger brother. So we talk about nature, that's not helping us. Nurture, the research seems fairly clear that it's still not helping us. So what about the environment? There is also a growing realization that perhaps it is not an unintended consequence that women are persistently denied opportunities for leadership. In fact, there is a great deal of growing evidence that suggests that our organizational and institutional cultures are structured in a way that women are simply not invited to the table. In July this year, many of you may have seen the Status of Women Canada report that was presented, a very comprehensive report, specifically looking at women on boards, right? And the need for adequate representation of women on boards in Canada. So this report goes on to look at the difference that women bring to the boards. And again, we're not talking about tokenism here. Like, put a woman on a board just because she's a woman. No, put a woman on a board because the board does better if there is a representation of the community that it is serving. Women, minority groups, whatever. There needs to be that diversity in order to have excellence. So there were 4 key drivers that the Status of Women report landed on for this failure of women to achieve leadership roles. First of all, there was a lack of focus on presenting talented female candidates by executive search firms, of all things. Executive search firms do better. They are thought of more highly if they are able to bring more men to the table. There is a lack of executive level commitment to gender diversity. It's very much lip service, but not something that executives really believe will make the company better. There is inadequate information on the availability of qualified women candidates for boards. And finally, there are predominantly male leadership networks, and we tend to choose people like ourselves. So if somebody comes to me and says, I'm looking for someone for our board, I need a real go-getter, I need someone who is going to not feel badly keeping management's feet to the fire, I'm thinking of women. That's who's coming to mind for me. And it's just human nature that we tend to think of someone like ourselves. So I guess this perfect storm of nature, of nurture, and then of this cultural environment is discouraging, right? And so the natural question is, what is the solution? And I don't have a solution for you. As is often the case with a thorny issue, a solution has to be multifaceted. You have to come at it from many different angles. How do we build girls and young women who are fierce about leadership from a young age, who are going to reach out and grab it? How do we do that? So coming out of this advisory report prepared by the Status of Women, it was recommended that the Government of Canada take a leadership position on gender balance by setting an ambitious goal for public appointments of women. Drawing on best practices, the Advisory Council members agree that a goal of 30% over 5 years is a great national threshold to aspire to, and with the longer-term goal of gender equity on the boards. Further, this council suggested that in the case of public companies, there should be a comply or explain policy, where publicly traded companies would be required to publish their goals and their policies related to gender equality, and then explain their results if they weren't able to achieve those. So organizations like Plan Canada and their campaign, Because I Am a Girl, and if you haven't looked at that, you really should. It's just a phenomenal campaign. Advocate very heavily for equal education for girls and boys in the developing world. Not, as I said to you earlier, out of a sense of justice, although that would push the advocacy in the same direction, but because this is a solution that will directly impact these developing communities. So solutions as these that try and get at the external environmental factors, try and change the culture for boys and girls, for men and women, are terrific. But what I want to talk about a little bit more tonight is, how do we get at the nature and nurture factors? We should be able to cover that in half an hour. Just clean that problem up and we'll solve it completely. So how do we form girls and young women for leadership? There are so many ways to get at this, and so many different people, institutions that are being truly committed to solving this problem. Many of you will be familiar with Sheryl Sandberg's work. And this is one of my favorites. I want every little girl who's told she's bossy to be told instead that she has leadership skills. Get rid of the bossy word. So, as a principal of the only women's university in this entire country, it's a bit of a daunting responsibility, but we take forming girls and young women for leadership very, very seriously. That is, I think, our single greatest contribution that we can make at Brescia. There is a huge deal of information out there that talks about how you create a set of conditions that allow for women to succeed, for girls to succeed, and so on. But tonight, I'm just going to limit my focus on what it is that we're doing at Brescia to try and move the needle in the right direction. So, our approach has several aspects to it, and we're going to go through them one by one. The first is it starts with girls. We learned a little while ago that we need to start talking about leadership to the girls in our life at a very young age, before they opt out, before they decide that it's not worth the risk. They don't want to stand up at the front. They don't want to, they don't want to raise their heads above the crowd in any way. So in 2007, Brescia began its Girls Lead Domestic Summer Day Camp. The camp curriculum has gone through several iterations. We don't advertise it because it sells out within a week of our camp opening every year. It's just oversold. But it is the most amazing, and I can say that it predates me. It is the most amazing camp that focuses these little girls from grade 3 through to grade 8 on leadership and on thinking about themselves as leaders. This camp has been expanded to include a high school edition. Now we have an international division. We've been providing this same camp experience to girls in Barbados for the past 5 years. And beginning 3 years ago, each summer we've invited several groups of young girls and high school age girls from Hong Kong to attend our camp. They come for a couple of weeks. They live in London. We do have a trip to Niagara Falls, but they do a lot of leadership curriculum. We have confirmed through this initiative what the scholars have already told us, that girls, much more so than boys, learn best from their peers and are inspired by their peers. So I'll tell you a a bit of a personal story. We arrived in London in June of 2008. You can imagine we moved a very young family from Toronto so that I could take up this position, and we were trying to sort of get established. We didn't know anybody in the city and get everybody sorted. So, as you heard earlier, we have 3 kids, and at that time their ages were 11, 9, and 4. The 9 and the 4 were girls. Still are. Our middle child is Emily. That summer, I enrolled Emily at the ripe old age of 9 into Brescia's Girls Lead Camp, and I will never forget picking her up from that camp at the end of her very first day. She has these like big dinner plate eyes, and they were even bigger in her face. She was so excited. She was so animated as I picked her up. She's telling me everything that she did, and then her voice just took on this aura of inspiration, and she told me about one of her counselors, Kate. And that's how she said it. Today, Mom, I met Kate. Kate, okay. She was nearly bursting as she told me everything that Kate, every word that had fallen out of Kate's lips that day, every precious word. And one of the things that Kate told her about leadership, that little cute 9-year-old that day was, wait for it, Emily, you can become anything you want when you grow up. If you want, you could become the Prime Minister of Canada. I looked into her face, I saw how excited she was, and my very loud inside voice was saying, I've been telling you that since before you were born. No impact. Kate had said it. Kate was 19. Not that I'm bitter, but it reminded me, it underlined for me, for girls to hear from other girls, and Kate was a lot more relevant to Emily than I was, let's be honest. At that point, it's probably worse now, but she's 15. Whew. Anyway, she came away just so certain that what she had learned, she could take to heart. And it's funny, I was coming here tonight and Emily was heading out to my other daughter's Christmas concert, and she said, Mom, are you going to tell them the story about Brescia Camp? And I said, I am. And she's like, I still remember that. I still remember when Kate told me that. So, girls and women, it's part of how we're wired. We learn best from our peers, even when you're 48. The best way that I solve a problem is to get in a group and sort it out and roll up our sleeves and in a very sort of interactive problem-solving model. That is, the research is very clear. That is how women learn best. And it starts when they're really young. So starting in 2009, we've done some other things in this department. We augmented this approach by introducing Take the Lead. Take the Lead is an excellent public speaking contest that Brescia runs annually. It's open only to girls in grades 11 and 12. We've done it every year since 2009. They are invited to prepare a very short speech on any topic related to leadership. And they present that speech to a panel of judges in a small room. So there's a preliminary round, and we're spread out in all the classrooms around our campus. And you might have 4 of these young women in the room and 10 people, their cheering section and a couple of judges. And then those who do best advance to a public final round. That's in our auditorium with 300 people, a little more nerve-wracking. We've only had one girl faint, but anyway, nobody else has fainted. So the first prize is a good one. It's a year of free tuition and free residence at Brescia. And we have quite a lot of women, quite a lot of mothers and fathers who really want their girls to talk about leadership. I remember the first year that we ran this, I made the cardinal error that they teach you in law school never to do, which is to ask a question you don't know the answer to. Like, you never do that. And there I was being interviewed on CTV with the winner of our contest, and I got to say to her, stupid, me, say to her, why did you want to do this contest? And she said, oh, I didn't. My mother made me do it. My mother made me do it. I had no interest in doing this contest. But what we learn is that these young women, these girls and young women that come to us, get this incredible boost of confidence and start thinking about themselves using a different set of labels. They start thinking about themselves as having the potential for leadership. So we keep in touch with all the young women who come through that program. Wherever they go to school, some are with us, some are around the world. And we have Take the Lead alumni events, just where they come back and we talk. And every one of them says, that was a life-changing moment, where I thought about myself as maybe having what it takes someday to be a leader. So we start with the girls. The next thing we do is we encourage our students to be reflective practitioners of leadership. We recognize that obviously you have to start forming leadership with very young women, girls. But Brescia also works very hard with the students that come to us to ensure that that leadership formation continues. And we use what I describe as a reflective practitioner model of learning, so that we will develop this approach in our students. So as you can see, it's really three parts. You start with the study, the theory. Then you practice your leadership. You try and apply it. And then you reflect on that practice. So you think about the practice that you've just done, and you think about the theory that you first learned. And what that does is it creates a circle so that your theory of leadership, your knowledge is shifted by what you've learned through practice. So it's a continuing cycle. It's a model that, for those of you that are interested, was introduced not in the context of leadership, but just in the context of being practitioners by Donald Schoen in the mid-80s. So let's start with the intellectual study. In 2010, Brescia established a degree in the dimensions of leadership. So we've been doing leadership for 100 years, and I said, well, shouldn't we maybe have a degree? So we have a major in leadership. Lots and lots of students are engaged in that. That major looks at leadership through a series of lenses. It is not corporate leadership. So it's very different than a business school model, which is the most common model for teaching leadership. And in fact, we have faculty in so many areas that touch on leadership that bring something to the study of leadership, whether it's political scientists or historians or sociologists or business and organizational theorists, psychologists, English literature faculty, those who are involved in spiritual studies. We believe that each of these disciplines offers a distinct lens looking at leadership and studying leadership. So for example, one of the courses that our students take, what can we learn about leadership by studying the heroines of Shakespeare's key tragedies? By looking at Lady Macbeth, what does she teach us about leadership? By looking at Portia from The Merchant of Venice, what does she tell us about her time and women in leadership? Or we move over to political science and in looking at Canada's political history, why have our female leader role models been so few and far between? Like, what is it about our political history? How is it that corporate organizations are structured in a way that conflicts directly with what we typically think of female manners of engaging in the workplace? Why is it that voters and the media often focus on the ideas of male candidates and on the hair color, the skin quality, the body shape of female candidates? I read amazing work that focused on the US Democratic primary race between then Senator Barack Obama and then Senator Hillary Clinton, and how there was just this refusal to focus on Clinton's ideas, and it was about her roots or her behind or whatever. That's what most of the discourse was about. Disciplines across the arts, the humanities, business, social sciences can all tell us something about leadership. And at Brescia, this course that we have, well, it's a major, it's a degree, brings all of that together. So now we've talked about the study. How do we acquire leadership skills? Under Schoen's model, the next step for this deep level learning is to take the study of leadership and then practice, apply it. So at Brescia, we have developed a very, very comprehensive model of leadership practice, and it runs across everything that we do. In our studies of leadership, the Dimensions program that I talked to you about earlier, there is a mandatory leadership placement where you are working in a firm either with the leadership of that organization or you are working in a management consulting firm that focuses on coaching others on leadership. So you're actually seeing leadership in action in one or many different ways. But for students who aren't studying leadership, even being a student at Brescia, there are just endless opportunities for leadership where you are being coached and where you are reflecting on your own leadership. So let me give you a couple of examples. Of course, our Students' Council is the only all-women student council in the country. On a weekly basis, we have faculty and staff, senior level staff, who are focused on coaching and working with that executive council, helping them with their own leadership, how they approach problems, what are the best ways to bring divergent views together, and what did they learn from last week when they had that problem, whatever it might have been. What do we learn going forward? So there is a coaching aspect, so that you aren't just experiencing it and then moving on like a hit and run. You're experiencing something and then reflecting on it. Our Residence Life program is a very, very similar model. It's based on a very rigorous training model for our residence assistants with coaching, peer mentoring, opportunities where they come together reflecting on leadership. Leadership workshops, leadership book clubs, whole 9 yards. We have introduced this year a soft peer mentor program. So many of you will remember, whether you're at Western or where you were, O Week and what that was like. And you have the softs, who are the orientation week. They are the leaders, usually second year or third year students, who are assisting the first year students in transitioning to the university. Usually, once O Week is over, they go their separate ways and that's the end of it. We've actually developed a program this year where those sophomores, or softs as they're called, stay in touch very closely with the first year students they've encountered in their groups in O Week for that entire first year. And again, that is coached and facilitated by faculty and staff specializing in leadership. We also, Brescia has an award-winning peer mentoring program where we connect our students with mentors in the community, mostly women engaged in leadership roles or any sort of a role where they're willing to spend time with our students over a year and talk to them about what it is in the working world and some of the things you encounter. These are just a few examples of what Schoen would talk about when he says you have to now acquire the practice. You have to take what you've learned and then you have to practice. And then what you do is to make meaning out of that experience, and that's the final part. You have to look at what you learned and then see what you saw in practice and say, do I rethink what I learned at the beginning? And you start that whole cycle over again. So we are still in the early stages of this at Brescia. Our leadership program is 5 years old. We are constantly refining it. We are constantly changing it. But our students are going on to great things. Some are going right into the workplace. Some are graduating into law or business or any other place. But what I hear from them again and again and again, and it's usually at convocation, is, you know, some of these leadership opportunities change their lives. So we like to take comfort that we are having some part in this solution that I've talked about. So the other thing that we do that I think is very important is we partner with the community. It's a successful strategy. So in 2012, Plan Canada worked with the Status of Women to advocate for the establishment of a global day to recognize the value and importance of girls in the world. You may know that, in fact, the United Nations embraced this idea and declared October 11, 2012 as the International Day of the Girl, and it's been every year since. So our local Member of Parliament for London North Centre, and who's the Parliamentary Secretary for the Status of Women, Susan Trupe, contacted Brescia and said, there's an International Day of the Girl. And I said, great. She said, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? I said, I didn't even know there was one. Like, it had happened about 4 minutes earlier. So she said, we're going to work with you. We're going to do something together. So Brescia partnered with Susan's assistant with the two local school boards, London District Catholic and Thames Valley, and we invited 300 girls, grade 7, to our campus for a full day of leadership workshops and activities. We had a band at lunch that was led by a young woman in this rock band. They were very, very loud. Very loud. I'm getting old. They were really loud. Anyway, we did this, and we've done that every year since. And I get these thank you notes from these girls saying, it was really great being at your school. I'd like to go to your school someday and be in the band. And I'm thinking, great. I hope she got more out of it than wanting to be in the band. Earlier this year, we were approached by Carolyn Martin, who is a community leader and founder of Shine Fitness. She's bringing something like this. She is created a workshop for girls. It's called Bring It. It will happen on May 2nd in 2015, and we were happy to partner with her and to say, yes, we'd like to sponsor that. We'd like to be a part of that. It's for girls who are 10 to 12, so grade 6 to 8, I think, is what she's working with. Again, another full day of very positive wellness leadership programming. So what we are seeing is we're starting to be a catalyst and seeing these opportunities in the community because Brescia is willing to support and embrace them. We have our students who automatically become supporters, running workshops and talking to girls. And that community is coming in and we are going out to the community. So that synergy is fantastic. And the final thing that I think we do very well is we are starting as a strategy to recognize leadership excellence in many different categories. Some of you may have known our inaugural chancellor. So we added a chancellor a year and a half ago, and it was Dr. Joan Francolini. Joan has now passed away, sadly, and we are looking for our next chancellor. But it's that opportunity to take a woman who is a strong leader and hold her up in front of our students and the whole community to say, we need to recognize this excellence. So Brescia will very soon be announcing what is a National Women's Leadership Award that will be done on a biannual basis. We will be recognizing leaders at different stages of women at different stages of leadership and institutions that support women in leadership. And that is something you can wait for and watch for. It will be happening next fall. So these are the ways that we try and form young women for leadership. It's sort of been a quick spin through, and depending on what clock we look at, I'm just about out of time. So I think I will probably stop there. If I've been successful tonight, then hopefully I've left you with the conviction that our world needs more girls and women to think about leadership. And our world needs to be different in a way that allows them access to that table and allows them to offer their skills. In doing that, we bring those female voices to the table, and we will all be better for it. So Brescia, I think, is doing our part. And we are trying very hard to be part of the solution of a problem that we have identified in the world, and in being leaders in that way. And the results are very encouraging. I can only tell you the number of young women who have said to me, I see myself in a different light now, and I see myself as maybe having something to offer to the world. I have a sense of direction. And thank you for that. That's why, even though I have to wear that really awful hat at convocation, it is just such a great opportunity, because invariably students will say, oh, I should go and talk to her, she's wearing the awful hat, and tell her how great my 4 years have been. So I hear some wonderful stories, and they invariably focus around leadership and that opportunity. So it's a good change to be part of. Thank you very much for listening tonight. Happy to take questions.